And there's such a desire to kill this movement. I mean, I couldn't believe this week that paper that came out that was all over the news when it hasn't even been published yet, about the ketogenic diet causing, increased mortality or whatever. I'm like, actually, I barely read it because I was so annoyed by the fact that it was an observational poster that hasn't even been peer reviewed, and it made headlines all over the world based on, a survey, and based on the fact that it wasn't even ketogenic, 25%, calories coming from carbs. I'm like, that's not even, all the healthy user buy, all of the problems of these studies that are doing so much harm. How desperate are they? There's the media and how excited are people to hear that keto is bad for you, that they're putting this on all over. I mean, I can't even tell you the amount of people that reached out to me to ask me, what do I think about this? And I'm like, just ignore it.
The details of that study are horrific. It's like
Yeah.
1,500 people. They take one food frequency questionnaire. What did you eat for the last year on average? 12
Right.
years ago. They don't follow it up. So do you think diets maybe change in 12 years? Like everybody eats differently all the time. And yeah, you're right. The percentages that they called keto and keto-like fit. I searched this. They are the same percentage as a double quarter pounder at McDonald's with the bun and all the trimmings. That macro fits what they were
Right.
studying.
And this type of error, or this, is this type of problem happens in so many of the trials, right? Remember the Eric trial that came out, I think, like 2019, where
Yes.
also it was, huge, but that one was actually published. This, I can't even find the paper. I couldn't, I think it was just like a poster or something, so anyway, it's very, very annoying, but
Yeah.
it just shows you the forces behind this. There's a real desire for, what I think it's jealousy. I think people they wish they could do it, but they can't. So that's why. I mean, that's
I
the only explanation I can think of.
I agree. I agree with you 100%. And the damage that has been done by all of these headlines that people read and don't know how to look into it and don't know how to look at the facts and how the study was conducted are just going to point to the headline and see, I knew it. I knew if I eat eggs and bacon in the morning, I'm going to die of a heart attack. And it was on
Right.
our local 9 o'clock news around here on a very popular outlet. They reported on it. That is so damaging. It's so damaging. You're right. I think they're jealous.
It's so damaging. It's insane. And it's so, as if there's nothing else to report in the world. There's so much going on in the world. But it also goes to show like how people are, like what we eat has become central. It's become so, so confusing. People don't know what to do.
Yeah,
They're
exactly.
really confused.
Yeah. Well, speaking
We're-
Speaking of confusion, we've covered this at every angle imaginable on this show, but I think it's still confusing for people understanding the relationship between glucose and insulin. If you don't mind, can you talk about everything that you've learned about glucose and insulin? And you mentioned, HK being diagnosed, I believe diagnosed diabetic for 30 years. He was actually
Yeah,
diagnosed. Okay, so
I
can we
know.
talk about so that's the diagnosis. There were issues before then. It's not like the
Right.
diabetes happened on that day. So can you talk a little bit about the things you've learned about the relationship between insulin and glucose and how our paradigm is wrong in that direction?
Sure. So, I mean, it's amazing. People do confuse insulin and glucose. And so let's go back. Okay. First of all, one of the main things I want people to understand is that diabetes, which by definition is having high glucose, is just a symptom of having high insulin. Okay. So let's start by having that in the background. So what happens is that when we eat the way we eat, which is basically, or we're recommended to eat, or like the food pyramid, which is based on carbohydrates at the base of the pyramid, and about, it varies, but let's say 60% of our diet composed of carbohydrates, and also processed food, including seed oils, which I think are playing more and more of a role here, as a potential cause of diabetes, which is really fascinating. And this which is we can touch on this later, but anyway, the cause is still a question mark. Okay, but we know that over time, when we eat the way we eat, okay, the body in a way gets stuffed up. Okay, it cannot store anymore. Now, why is this important? Because insulin is the hormone that's released to help us store. Okay, so it's not released in the same way for every macronutrient. It's released a ton when we eat carbs. It's released a little bit when we eat protein and much less when we eat fats. So when we eat, if we eat a piece of bread, you're going to have a ton of insulin secreted. And if you have meat, with some fat on it in a salad, it's going to be much, much less. So if I eat a piece of bread, it gets broken down into glucose. Now, glucose is a simple sugar. Okay, bread in particular has more glucose. It has is mostly glucose. If you eat a fruit, it's like glucose and fructose. So things break down into simple sugars, and not all of them behave the same. But let's talk about glucose, okay? Because glucose is the one that really leads to or encourages the pancreas to secrete insulin. So the glucose comes into the blood. The pancreas has ways of sensing this and secretes insulin in response in order to get rid of the glucose as soon as possible. Glucose is toxic to blood cells, okay, to the vessels. You should not have high glucose, and therefore, at the minute sugar goes, there's no tolerance at all for having high glucose in the blood. Immediately, the insulin releases the pancreas releases insulin. Now, protein and fat actually don't really require that much insulin, as we said. So it's okay for this to be less regulated, but glucose is perfectly regulated very, very tightly. So insulin is released and the sugar is taken up by first the muscle, but many other cells in the body, okay? Now, the issue is that the same hormone that takes the glucose down in the blood also does a million other things. And one of the things it does is that it stores fat in the fat cell, okay? So basically, what I think people don't understand is that when I eat a carb, what I'm doing is I'm stimulating the hormone that's going to store this as fat. And that is something that even doctors don't make that connection, okay? And it's really that simple. Insulin stores fat. And the converse is true. I cannot burn fat in the presence of high insulin. So this is really, really, really important, okay? Because if you're eating breakfast, which is cereal, and then 2 hours later, you're eating a fruit, and then with your granola or whatever, and then you're having, this, and all day we're eating and eating and eating, you're secreting a ton of insulin. Now, the more insulin you secrete, the less your body wants to respond to it. Okay, so this is one mechanism by which we get insulin resistance, which means that insulin resistance means that the same piece of bread now will require a ton more insulin to get that out of the blood. All right, so you need more and more insulin to push that sugar in. Okay, because the body doesn't want to respond anymore. Now, it may be because there are many reasons for this, and it's really fascinating to look at all of the different theories, but all of them might be true and work simultaneously. Because, for example, the more insulin you have, there's a downgrading of the receptors, as I just said. There's in the number and in their function. Basically, the receptors are not working. You can say, okay, it's a kind of a way of protecting the cell. That's probably saying, and kind of, I'm giving personality to the cells, but meaning like, enough, I've stored enough, okay? Because what happens is that we have a certain capacity for storage of fat. So first we store fat subcutaneously, and when we run out of space, we start putting it in places where it shouldn't be. And this is called ectopic fat. And as we become fuller and fuller, and ectopic fat is a really bad thing. We do not want fat other than in fat cells, okay? Fat should be in fat cells. When we start accumulating fat in places where it shouldn't be, that organ stops working the way it should, okay? So let's take the example of fatty liver. When there's fat in the liver now starts actually working completely different the way it should. For example, liver should respond to insulin by actually storing glycogen, right? Storing glucose and converting it to glycogen, but instead it cranks out sugar. So it cranks out the glucose, and like this, many, many things. So bottom line is that there's this feeling that there's enough. I do not want to store anymore, which is, again, I'm personalizing, my husband gets really mad when I say that, but to me, this is the best way to understand this, right? The cells don't want to respond anymore. They don't want to store anymore. Or, if we look at it like fat in the muscle is stuffed. So the minute you have fat in the muscle, you become insulin resistant at the level of the muscle. And again, this is true also at every organ. So bottom line is that now your pancreas is going to secrete insulin, and it's not going to respond. So it's going to secrete more insulin, and the cells are not going to respond. So the sugar is still in there. Sugar cannot stay in the blood. This is toxic. It must secrete more insulin. It must secrete more insulin to the point that you end up having high insulin all the time, whether you eat and not eat. And now, what does that mean? You're always storing, even if you're not eating, you're still storing fat, which is why people can't lose weight. Okay. Yeah. But taking that one step further, okay, so that's called insulin resistance, right? So when you have high insulin, it's almost synonymous with insulin resistance, which is almost synonymous with metabolic syndrome. These are all difficult words because in the sense that we're kind of repeating ourselves, but it's not exactly the same, but close enough. So bottom line is that you have insulin that's all the time high, and we lost that important balance of secretion and decrease in secretion so that you can use what you stored. And in about 10% of these patients, you have a pancreas that starts to malfunction. Okay, so when the pancreas can't keep up with this amount of insulin, then what happens is that you have a lot of insulin, so you're still insulin resistant, but it's not enough to overcome the resistance because your pancreas is not working, and then you get diabetes. So you need two things to get diabetes: high insulin and high sugar.
Wow.
Does that answer your question? Sorry that it was so long.
It answered the question perfectly and very, very well. Thank you for that explanation. As you're talking, I'm imagining like an episode of Hoarders where people are bringing in stuff into the house. They have shopping addictions or whatever, and they can't throw stuff away. And so normally you could put all of your clothes in one closet, but if you're continuing to shop and shop and shop and buy a bunch of stuff, hoarders end up with way too much stuff in the house, and boxes pile up, and they can hardly get through the house, and the house is bursting at the seams with all of this crap. And so they'll come in and help the person clean it out, but they also need to have therapy with the people to say, you got to stop shopping, stop bringing more stuff in the house. Otherwise, it's just going to fill right back up again. So on that note,
it's a great analogy. Yeah.
Well, thank you.